The first half of the 20th century was surely fruitful for the piano concerto medium, as we know the well-known concertos by Rachmaninoff, Igor Stravinsky, Maurice Ravel, Bartok, Shostakovich, and Sergei Prokofiev. All of these composers had one thing in common. They were all prominent concert pianists at the same time. While we know that some of these composers wrote their first piano concertos at earlier ages, like Rachmaninoff did when he was 18 years old, some others, like Bartok or Ravel, decided to wait until their music language had got to a certain maturity. Indeed, Bartok was 45 years old when he wrote his first piano concerto, although it wasn't actually his first piece for orchestra accompanied solo piano music. His first two opus numbers were the Rhapsody and the Scherzo, both of which were for piano and orchestra that Bartok wrote when he was but a teenager. In both Scherzo and Rhapsody, piano sounds quite dominant with its virtuoso passages, and yet the orchestra does nothing but providing a colorful accompaniment to Bartok's nationalist tunes. For almost 30 years, until his first piano concerto, Bartok did not write anything else for the orchestra accompanied piano again. So, the year 1926, or in other words, Bela Bartok's piano year, is also the start of his middle period, which was when Bartok wrote his first piano concerto after the 30-year break he gave to this medium. He also wrote his piano sonata, Out of Doors, and 9 little piano pieces in the same year. The previous year, the year of 1925, Bartok made a lot of trips to Italy, which actually gave him the chance to get more acquainted with the music of the Baroque composers. This has reflected to his piano concertos by adopting the concerto grosso style, and thusly we hear the orchestra parts as equally soloistic as the piano part in all of Bartok's piano concertos. The characteristics of Bartok's compositions are often emphasized in his usage of Hungarian, Romanian, and Slovakian folk tunes. In addition to that, Bartok himself acknowledged that he underwent an artistic shift from Beethovenian aesthetics to Bachian core elements during his piano year of 1926. Nonetheless, his music had always been influenced by a variety of so many other styles and composers throughout his life. For instance, as we move on to his second piano concerto, which is the concerto that was written during the same middle period with his first one, we will actually witness themes that were derived from Stravinsky's ballets. But before we get into the details of it, let's briefly talk about his third piano concerto in order to understand the musical evolution in his piano concerto medium. The third piano concerto by Bela Bartok was one of the big works he wrote after leaving Hungary and immigrating to the United States. Or in other words, the third concerto actually belongs to his late periods along with the sonata and concerto for two pianos and percussion and the orchestra concerto. The third concerto once again reveals his folk music and illusions of music by Bach and Beethoven, and yet the texture appears much lighter than the previous two. A small part of the concerto was unfortunately unfinished due to his death. The orchestration of the last 18 measures later completed by his student Tibor Serli. Bartok began writing his second piano concerto in October 1930 and completed it a year after. When we compare it to the first concerto, we can clearly hear the tonal positivity with the G major blasting in the first and the third movements. Indeed, on some concert flyers or CDs, it would not be a big surprise if we saw the title as Bartok's Piano Concerto in G major. And once again, the idea of concerto for orchestras is still quite dominant in this one too, as he himself declared that neither of his concertos is for piano accompanied by orchestra, but for piano and orchestra, for he has given the soloist and the ensemble entirely equal roles in both. Now, we talked a little bit about the Stravinsky influence on the second piano concerto, which was manifested in two aspects: the thematic and the orchestration. In the first movement, the entire string section is tacet, which leaves piano with the accompaniment of winds and percussion. Writing concertos for piano and wind ensemble was still not a very popular idea in the first half of the 20th century, until Igor Stravinsky wrote one in 1926. Strings later come back at the beginning of the second movement of Bartok's second piano concerto. So at the beginning of this lecture, we have mentioned some other composers too, such as Prokofiev, Ravel, Rachmaninoff, or Shostakovich for their many piano concertos. But there's actually one more aspect that ties them up. They have all used traditional forms, like sonata allegro, or the lead form in their concertos. Bartok did the same thing, and in fact, he brought it one step further and gave a double function formal structure to his second piano concerto. While the first movement of this concerto is in sonata form, the entire movement is actually a big A section of the arc form, or the A, B, C, B, A structure of the entire concerto. We can also name it as a symmetry structure, which Bartok used for his many other pieces, like the string quartets, concerto for orchestra, and second violin concerto as well. This symmetry idea is actually quite popular in many of Bartok's music, and not only as in a formal structure, but also the intervallic relations of his themes and motifs. We encounter many examples of the usage of symmetry. Let's take a look at the bottom of the first page of the handout, as we can examine the subjects and the motifs that create these subjects. At the first, I would like to play the entire subject, or the main theme, on the piano. As we heard, I have played all three motifs that we see on the handout. We hear each motif on a different instrument. The first motif is first introduced by the trumpet, and the second one is on the piano. And the remainder on woodwinds. This kind of setup makes it even more obvious that the entire first subject was made of small motific cells. As opposed to this, let's take a brief look at the second theme that makes a total contrast to the first one, with containing actual phrases instead of small motific cells. Now the first part is the mosso that introduces us to the pure perfect octaves and fifths in measure 74. Same intervals appear in the chorale sections of the second movement that is played by strings. And the second part, the tranquillo, consists of the right hand and left hand patterns that are laid out as mirror symmetrical, which once again appeared at the choral section in the opening of the second movement that I just played. So let's hear the tranquillo. I'm going to play this section again. The motif that is introduced by horns in measure 99 of the first movement is another one that was derived from the tranquillo piano section by the expansion of the scalar intervals. So this way, we constantly hear themes that are derived from previous themes throughout the entirety of this second piano concerto. And while we do that, we also hear themes and motifs that are inverted or reversed. But where did the first subject motifs originally derive from? Musicologist and Bartok scholar Peter Burkholder discusses that Bartok used paraphrasing as using an existing tune to form a new melody, theme, or motif. Also, musicologist David Schneider cites two examples from Stravinsky's theme from the finale of The Firebird. Now, let's hear the Stravinsky's Firebird theme from the finale that is transposed to G major. once again, here is the opening fanfare or the motif A of the second piano concerto's first subject. The resemblance is pretty clear, right? As for the motif B from the first subject group, it also seems to be another borrowing from the Russian dance of Stravinsky's Petrushka. And here is motif B as it is the way that it is heard on the piano in the second concerto. And once again, the motif C has mostly been derived from motif A, and as a result, we once again hear the Stravinsky resemblance. So what about the recap of the first movement? That's right, all the motifs and themes come back, and yet we hear them all inverted. Once again, let's remember motif A. And now let's see how it appears on the recap of the first movement. So, both on exposition and on recap, the motif is played on trumpet. And here is motif B. And its version on recap. And motif C. And the recap of motif C. And once again, the instrumentation remained the same in both recap and the exposition. And these motifs are played by the exact same instruments. Once again, the motif B was played by piano on exposition, and on the recap is the same story. And the motif C were played by woodwinds, primarily bassoon, clarinet, and oboe, and on both exposition and the recap, the motif C was played by woodwinds. And what about the second subject group, the mosso or the tranquillo? Well, we won't hear them in a while, although once again we find variations of them in later movements, as can be seen in the charts of the formal structure. What's happening in the other movements? Once again, we should remember the double function form. Although each movement has its own formal structure, they all form a bigger arc form of A, B, C, B, A. And the second movement thusly contains the B, C, and B2 parts or sections of this big arc form, which actually makes the movement in ABA ternary form. The structure is pretty obvious even to the first time listener because of the big tempo changes. The movement starts slow in adagio, and later on the middle B section comes in presto, which is followed by the adagio A section again. This separation is that exact in all the scores and parts of this movement. The measures are numbered separately. The A section of this second movement starts from measure 1 and goes all the way to measure 64. And later on, the presto B section starts from its own measure 1 and ends in measure 208 and so forth. The third movement is in 7-part rondo form. According to Bartok, the rondo character is only in the exposition of this movement, as the E-flat minor refrain subject is the only new thematic material that appears in total of 4 parts, whereas the remaining parts, the episodes and the coda, are free variations of the first movement subjects. The entirety of the first movement's thematic material could be found in the third movement as inverted, converted, and extended by the scalar intervals. We hear the first theme of the first movement again at the end of the third movement, which creates the symmetry idea of the entire concerto more clearly. The employments of the motifs based on the folk tunes and Stravinsky's ballets, as well as his own motifs and rhythm, are crucial to comprehend symmetrical structure of this second piano concerto by Béla Bartók.